Imagine you have that one friend, that neighbor who's always up before everybody else. A single mom, 2 little boys, lights on at the crack of dawn every morning without fail. Someone that you can always count on. But one freezing winter morning, you knock on her door and there's nothing. No answer, no footsteps, no just a minute, no sound at all. Just a deadbolted door that won't budge and a bad feeling that you can't shake. Where is she? And more concerning, where are her kids? She has 2 little boys, a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. You call out and you hear a tiny voice on the other side of that door and you realize it's one of her toddlers. But where's their mom? You knock until you finally coax the 3-year-old to turn the deadbolt. And when he finally does, you step inside and you're faced with the horror of your neighbor lying on the couch lifeless. Her 2 little boys have been trapped in that apartment with her body all night long. For today, it was a cold January morning in Twinsburg, Ohio, in the Pinewood Gardens apartments. Most people were just starting their day, getting their kids ready for school, heading to work that Monday morning. And one person who is always up early is Charlene Puffenbarger. Her neighbor and friend Michelle Smithermans knew that about Charlene. She was dependable, single mom to 2 little boys and also a nanny to many of the other kids in the apartment complex. The type of woman who somehow managed to be awake, get dressed, and do all the things a mom needs to do in the morning without hitting snooze. So when Michelle got a knock on her door that morning from another neighbor, Yvette Carter, saying that Charlene was not home or not answering her door, Yvette was worried because she was dropping her kids off to be watched by Charlene like she did every workday. And Charlene wasn't answering. That's when Michelle jumped into action. Michelle walks over to her friend Charlene's door with Yvette and her children, and they knock together. And there's no answer. It's not just odd, it's wrong. And Michelle knocks again, and she's listening, and there's nothing. No footsteps, no shuffling, no sleepy kid voices. And ever since Michelle knew Charlene, she had known her to be an early riser. By now, she should be up for sure. She should be moving around, maybe getting her boys fed breakfast, watching one of the other neighborhood kids as their daycare provider, but the door stays closed. The apartment stays silent. That feeling, and you know the one in your stomach that just drops before your brain can even explain why, that was what hit Michelle. This isn't a she must be sleeping in kind of scenario. It's not that kind of silence. And you may have thought, well, why doesn't Michelle just call Charlene? Well, unfortunately, Charlene didn't have a phone in her apartment. This was a woman who was trying her very best to make ends meet. Everyone that meant anything to Charlene was always in her orbit, so she didn't need a phone. It wasn't a necessity in her life. Michelle doesn't walk away. She doesn't shrug it off. She does what a good friend does. She goes to get help. While Yvette waits, Michelle heads over to her brother Mitchell's apartment. He lives in the very same complex. They both know Charlene. They both know her boys, 3-year-old Dustin and 2-year-old Derek. When Michelle tells her brother that something is wrong, he doesn't hesitate. He believes her. So now it's both of them walking back to Charlene's door, trying to shake off that creepy feeling of dread. They're trying to think practical thoughts. Maybe she's in the shower. Maybe for once in her life she did oversleep. Maybe she's just keeping her kids busy. Maybe. That's what we all want to go to. But they reach for the door, and Mitchell tries the handle, and it doesn't budge. They realize the door is not just locked, it's deadbolted. Mitchell calls through the door, and he tries to get Charlene's attention, but there's nothing. And then faintly, he realizes that he hears a voice. It's 3-year-old Dustin on the other side of that door. Somehow, Yvette manages to coax this little boy to undo a deadbolt that grown-up adults can't even get past from the outside, of course. And here are these tiny hands on the lock that was never meant to be his responsibility. And then the bolt slides. Yvette opens the door. She and Mitchell step inside. And with Yvette in the front, standing in Charlene's living room, what she sees stops her cold. It's Charlene. She's lying on one of the living room couches, and at first glance, it could look like she's asleep. But as they move closer, they knew she wasn't sleeping. There was a blanket over her head and her body, and it's covered in blood. They didn't need any special training or experience to know that this is not a medical emergency. It's not a fainting spell. It's not a fall. This is a crime scene. In that moment, Mitchell has to make an impossible snap decision. He doesn't have the luxury of breaking down or freezing in horror. There's 2 little boys there. He picks them up and he carries them out of that apartment, away from the couch and away from their mother's body. How long had she been like this? How long had these poor boys been inside that small apartment with their mother's dead body? Little Dustin says, "We couldn't wake Mommy, and it was heartbreaking." Mitchell gets them to safety first. Only then does he call for help. The call that goes in to the Twinsburg Township Police Department and the Summit County Investigator's Office is labeled as an unknown injury. That's the language on paper. That's what the system relays to local patrol. But when the first officer arrives, it only takes him a second to realize there is nothing unknown about this. Charlene is clearly deceased. Her face is stained with blood. There's a belt around her neck and defensive wounds. They're on her hands and her arms. She fought for her life. At this point, all anyone knows is that something terrible has happened behind that door, and these 2 little boys just lived through a night that no child should ever have to witness. Before we talk about what happened inside the apartment, we need to talk about the woman who lived there. Charlene K. Puffenbarger. She came into the world on August 16th of 1965 in Cleveland, Ohio. And from the very beginning, she was loved by her parents, Phyllis and Charles, so much. She was named after her father, and they were overjoyed when their daughter was born. She would be their only daughter, and this wasn't just, we had a baby. No, it wasn't that kind of happy. It was the kind of proud joy where you start imagining everything, their birthday parties, their first school trip, every milestone before they ever happen. And at home, Charlene wasn't the only child for long. Her brother, Kenneth, came along 5 years later, and their bond wasn't just the whole we get along sometimes because we're siblings. They were loving, and Ken was so protective. It was his job to look out for his sister. He was the one making sure that she felt safe, the one who would step in if anybody was giving her a hard time, the one who was always on her side. They shared the kind of sibling relationship where jokes stack up over the years, where you can read each other's moods with a single look. And when people say their bond was unbreakable, it wasn't just a saying. That's how they lived, and they shared so many memories growing up together in Twinsburg, Ohio. So I think it's just fitting for me to tell you a little bit more about Twinsburg. I like going to new places, and this place is a little bit quirky, but in the best way. If you've ever heard of Twinsburg, then you know that it's known for Twin Days, and this festival is about coming together and celebrating twins. And growing up there meant that once a year, your little town turned into this surreal little universe of matching faces, identical outfits, and siblings everywhere. It's the kind of small town backdrop that makes childhood feel a little bit more magical, like the world is smaller and closer than it really is. But there's more to Twinsburg than its name and an annual festival. It's a very close-knit community of only 6,000 people when Charlene was a kid. Now there's about 19,000, which is still small. So you can only imagine what it was like in the 70s. We're talking about a place where you really did recognize most of the faces you saw at the grocery store or at the Friday night football game. A huge part of life revolved around work at the Chrysler stamping plant opened in 1957, or the one that Ford owned. It was one of the largest automotive plants in the country and a major employer for people who lived in Twinsburg. A lot of families had at least one person on shifts at an automotive factory or commuting to other industrial jobs in Cleveland or in Akron. Other people worked in schools, at local shops, at banks, diners, or small professional offices. There were still people tied to farm life and greenhouse work on the edges of town, especially where the older farms hadn't been carved up into subdivisions yet. Some streets were still half finished, with patchy sidewalks and gravel shoulders and trees that hadn't grown in yet. For fun, Kids like Charlene leaned hard into school and community life, high school sports, band events, and things like Girl Scouts. Now, the Twinsburg Twin Festival didn't even happen until 1976, and that quickly did become a very big deal there. Growing up, Charlene wasn't really handed that neat linear storybook script. Like many young women, she wanted to find her Prince Charming, and she thought she had when she met Alan Redman. They just clicked. They were both in their early 20s, and they had a lot of fun together, and soon there was a baby boy on the way. But even before little Dustin got there in June of 1988, things between Charlene and Alan went downhill. She decided to leave, even if it meant that she had to care for Dustin all on her own at 23 years old, which she did with the help of her mother. She was going to leave. And then she met Willard McCarley. He was a single dad, and this seemed more promising. He understood her situation, having an ex and a baby, and they were hanging out all the time and eventually started dating. Phyllis, her mom, liked Willard. He was fun. He was dedicated to Charlene and treated Dustin like he was his own child. Phyllis remembered a date that Willard took Charlene on for her birthday, August 16th, and she came back just glowing. Phyllis knew how much she liked Willard. It was obvious. Charlene's mother also knew that Charlene wasn't interested in something casual. She wanted a real commitment and a family and more kids, a husband, the house, the things that most of us want. Willard seemed to want those things too. Until Charlene got pregnant. It's like a broken record. Maybe Willard was content with them both having one child each from previous relationships, and both their kids were still very young. Willard's son was only 6, and Charlene's little boy, Dustin, was only over 2 months old. That is still so little. It was probably a lot at once. And now Charlene was going to have 2 children less than a year apart, and ironically, they call those type of babies that close together Irish twins. And yes, I know, I looked it up and I realized that Irish twins used to be derogatory, but when siblings are born that close together, that's what they were commonly called. I have a family member who has 2 girls that are like that, and I think it's absolutely awesome. They're so close, and that's how Dustin and little Derek were. Derek arrived May of 1989. They were so close, they were almost like twins, really. But the bad news is, it was a little too much for Willard, and he wasn't interested in sticking around. So unfortunately, Charlene was yet again a single mother. Now, luckily, her mom was there for her, helping her with everything. But eventually, Charlene was able to get approved for an apartment of her own at Pinewood Gardens, which was a public housing complex with affordable rentals for low-income families. There were a lot of other single moms living there, and she bonded with several of her neighbors right away. Eventually, Charlene began babysitting her neighbors' kids for extra cash. That way, she could be home with little Dustin and Derek, but still make an income. It was a small community, only 125 units, quiet, a place where everyone knew one another and felt safe. One resident who became one of Charlene's closest friends was Michelle Smithermans. Michelle lived in one of the buildings right across the street from Charlene's in the same complex, and they would come to each other's apartments all the time. Charlene absolutely loved cooking, and her friends, of course, didn't mind, so she would get right in the kitchen and make her specialty, snickerdoodle cookies. But slowing down and pausing here for a second, it was still a lot. 2 boys, 2 fathers, 1 mom doing everything she could to keep their little world balanced. But Charlene can handle it. Inside that apartment, she was doing what so many moms in her position do, stretching every penny, every bag of groceries, every ounce of her energy, trying to turn barely enough into just a little bit more for her boys. She worked hard to provide for them, not just food and shelter, but love and stability, and the kind of stability that mattered more than what kind of furniture you had or how new your carpet was. What Pinewood Gardens lacked in luxury, Charlene definitely made up for with the community there. Everyone had similar struggles. They were fighting the same fight, and they were there for one another. When someone needed something, all they had to do was knock on a neighbor's door. It wasn't perfect, but it was a network, and in that space, they tried to keep each other standing. Charlene was content, not because this was easy, but because she had what mattered the most to her, her boys, Dustin and Derek. She was genuinely excited to watch them grow up. But now, we have to remember, this woman is dead. She never got that chance. And I hate when I learn so much about someone and realize why I'm researching their life. Because it was taken. Charlene, of all people, did not deserve this. And no one knew who would have wanted to hurt someone like her. She was so loving. She was so giving. She really didn't have any enemies. So let me take you back to that morning that she was found. After the 911 call went out, rookie cop Eric Briding was on patrol in that area, and over the radio, he's called out to the Pinewood Gardens apartments number 6 for what was referred to as, I said, an unknown injury. It's kind of a weird way to alert an officer that a person was deceased. But before he even had a chance to ask questions, the dispatcher comes back on the radio and says, "Eric, this sounds bad. Hurry." And he did. Charlene lived up on the 2nd floor. Her door was immediately to the right as soon as you got up the stairwell. Now, these were external hallways. This building was not enclosed where you would go through a main door. No. This was on the outside. All of these doors faced right outside so that anyone could come up from the street. Michelle met with the officer and explained what she and the others had discovered inside, how the door was deadbolted, how the kids were inside alone with their mom lifeless on the couch. This was a small 1-bedroom apartment, and I want to give you a visual as best as I can of what it consisted of, especially the living room area where her body was found. But I also have some crime scene photos, so that should help. And I will, of course, blur what I need to. As soon as you walk in, you're standing in the living room, which consisted of a rocking chair, a lazy boy, a coffee table, TV that was an entertainment center, and lots of toys scattered around. An Etch-a-Sketch, a toy airplane, stuffed animals, toy cars, and 2 couches. One was one of those old school plaid ones I'm sure many of your grandparents had. I know my mom had one. And one of them was a velvet, dark bluish purple colored couch. And it was right under the window. And that was the couch that Charlene was lying on. There was a light blue and white flower comforter that was covering Charlene's entire body, including her head, when her friends first came inside. They pulled back the top part, and that's when they saw all the blood underneath her head, on her head, and soaked into the pillow underneath. Now, there was a Pepsi can on top of the comforter near her legs, and beside her was one of those satin school jackets. It was kind of like a baseball-style jacket, and it has buttons down the front, and it was black with yellow stripes on the waistband. It was kind of shoved or thrown between her and the couch cushion, and under her legs was a bloody pillow. It had splotches on it. There was also a pack of cigarettes and a lighter on the windowsill, and the windows were closed. An electric guitar was at the end of the couch, and there was also what looked like a makeshift bed on the other couch. Perhaps one of her children, like her 3-year-old Dustin, might have slept there. Not really sure. But you could see a pillow and some blankets on the couch as well. And you can hardly see it, but in one of the corners of this photo, there's not quite a crib, but almost like a toddler bed in the same room. So it almost appeared as though she may stay in the main primary bedroom and the children slept in the living room on the couches or even in bed with her. The kitchen was very clean, and so was her bedroom and bathroom. Inside her closet, everything was neat and nice and very organized. That's why it was odd when they found her purse on the lazy boy in the living room, just feet away from her body. It looked as though it had been rummaged through. Her social security card, her license, a bunch of paperwork was scattered around. Nothing else about the apartment looked ransacked, but they did notice her keys were missing, which included the key to her apartment, which meant that someone took them with them and locked the door behind them. We're going to get back to that. But now I want to focus on Charlene. She had dried blood on her face, and a black leather belt was tightly wrapped around her neck twice. She had several scalp lacerations and a number of defensive wounds on her hands. Officer Briding was stunned. He said he wasn't panicking, but this was his very first murder case. He told himself, "You cannot F this up. You have to get this right." He immediately radioed for backup, and by the time the other officers arrived with homicide detective Patricia Kungle to begin processing this scene, Charlene's boys were brought back over to the apartment so that arrangements could be made for Charlene's mom to come get them. But then something shocking happened. When Dustin saw the uniformed police officers, he pointed to one of them and he shouted, "It was him! He hurt my mommy!" No one could have expected that. Not at all. Everyone was looking at this officer and then looking at each other. And I mean, they did not think that this cop in particular had anything to do with Charlene's murder. But of course, he had to be ruled out just in case. And he was, by the way. But what was important was something about this man. One, he was in a police uniform. And also maybe his facial features, the style of his hair, his height, his skin color, something about him he must have had in common with the killer. I mean, we're talking about a 3-year-old. I understand that. But the way that Dustin pointed and the way he said, "It was him," It just really seemed too much to be some kind of accident or a coincidence. Something about that officer triggered him. Homicide Detective Patricia Kungle noted that officer had on a winter police coat. She referred to it as a Tuffy coat, and I looked it up online just to get a visual. These are more heavy duty, they're weatherproof, and they have big gold buttons on the front and patches on the sides and the shoulders. To Detective Kungle, the type of jacket this officer was wearing could be very significant. While evidence was being collected, Charlene's mother was called, and they alerted her to please come to Charlene's apartment. Now, they didn't want to tell her what happened over the phone, so they were pretty vague. A neighbor was the one speaking to her, and she told her that Charlene had been in an accident and that she was hurt, but not to rush. And I mean, wouldn't Charlene being hurt warrant rushing? So right there, I would have thought that was kind of odd. Like, how bad was she hurt? And that's what Phyllis was wondering. She was also wondering, where were the boys? Were they okay? And all these questions were going through her mind on that drive. And once she got there, she knew that something bad happened. There was crime scene tape up near the stairwell to Charlene's apartment. She tried to push her way through with the bystanders all around, but once she was near the yellow tape, she was told she was not permitted to pass. Even though this was Charlene's mother, they turned her away. She was begging to see her daughter, and that is when she was notified that Charlene was dead and that she had been murdered. And that was unbelievable. The word murder, the knowledge that Dustin and Derek, these two little boys, were there while it happened. And somehow, in the middle of all of this, she had to do something almost impossible. She had to pick up the phone and call her husband, as well as her son, Ken, Charlene's brother, and let them know that Charlene was dead. Ken was at college at the time when his mom called, and all she could say was, "Charlene is gone." It didn't take long for him to understand what she meant. Just the sound of her voice alone spoke volumes. He rushed home thinking about her two boys the entire time, his nephews, left motherless, his sister only 26 years old. Who could have done this? While the family was reeling from the news, the apartment itself became the center of a painstaking, methodical search for answers. They went over the apartment inch by inch. More than 150 separate items were collected, tagged, and stored as evidence. That's a lot. That number alone tells you how seriously they were taking this case. They understood that in a case like this, the difference between unsolved and justice might come down to something as small as a single fiber, a hair, a smear of blood only visible under certain light. They were never going to get a second chance at examining this room. They cut out sections of her carpet. They looked for hidden diluted blood evidence, and they disassembled the entire couch, taking all the cushions apart rather than just taking photos. Every surface around Charlene's body was studied. Every angle was considered. The sink, the tub drains, they were not just glanced at. They were opened up and investigators removed the drain covers. They checked for anything that might have tried to be washed away in a panic. Traces of blood, hairs, fibers, anything that didn't belong there. Every item they touched was carefully cataloged and preserved. Because once you leave that scene, and it's been cleaned, you cannot go back and recreate any of it. This was their one shot at capturing whatever the killer had left behind. And as they documented and measured and bagged each item of potential evidence, one detail kept circling back in their minds. There was no evidence of forced entry. That stood out. And I told you I was going to circle back to the fact that the killer must have taken her keys and locked the door behind them. There was no kicked-in door, no pry marks, no broken lock, nothing that said a stranger fought their way into this apartment. It strongly suggested that whoever came through that door had either been let in by Charlene or they had the means to unlock it and relock it themselves. It was almost as though they didn't want the kids to get out. Maybe so that they couldn't run to get a neighbor for help. Or was it to keep them safe? There were lots of questions, but they got some answers from Charlene's autopsy, which was conducted by the Summit County coroner, William Cox. Charlene was fully clothed. None of her clothes were disheveled. The buttons were still intact. No garments were ripped. So this did not look like a sexually motivated crime. But what stood out was the petechial hemorrhages all over Charlene's face and the whites of her eyes. And these are little tiny broken blood vessels, and they show pressure was put on her to stop her breathing. There were lacerations on her head, and there were also scrapes and abrasions to her face. There were more wounds on her forearms and the back of her hands, as though she was using them to cover her head and face as her attacker kept hitting her with something. When the pathologist opened her mouth, He was shocked. He found a small plastic baggie stuffed inside that contained an unidentified white powder. He sent it to the crime lab for testing, and there was also ligature marks around her neck from where the belt had been. And even though it was tied around her neck twice, the coroner ruled this was not the cause of her death. It was due to asphyxiation, which is different than strangulation. Both of them cut off your ability to breathe. Strangulation is actually a specific type of asphyxiation, which is the lack of oxygen to the body. With strangulation, though, that's pressure on the neck specifically. But asphyxiation itself can be caused by many things: choking, drowning, something being placed over your face like a pillow. And that is what the coroner assumed happened in this case. Recall that there was a bloody pillow on the couch near Charlene's legs. It contained blood splotches and smears, which appeared to come from a struggle as she tried to breathe while someone was holding it over her wounded face. Her time of death was estimated to be approximately 12 to 1 a.m. on Monday, January 20th, 1992. So just a few hours before her body was officially found, right before 10 a.m. The conclusion was that Charlene had suffered severe injuries from blunt force trauma. Someone had hit her hard enough, more than once in the head, to cause significant damage. And then, of course, there was the belt around her neck. But when her attacker realized that she was still alive, they didn't stop. They smothered her with a pillow, forcing the air from her lungs until her body gave out. Who did Charlene trust enough to open her door to on a cold January night? Who knew her well enough to have keys, or maybe they were bold enough to take them? And who could look at two sleeping boys and still walk away knowing exactly what they were leaving behind? Those answers would not come quickly. And the one person who truly saw what happened inside that apartment was a 3-year-old. In the days and weeks after Charlene's murder, the apartment in Pinewood Gardens was no longer just a home. It was a crime scene and a rumor mill. So many people had their thoughts on what happened, and many of them were terrified to stay there. A lot of people moved out. Others were so scared, they had neighbors stay with them. And Michelle was one of those people that were very fearful. She could not believe that her friend was dead. The sense of safety was shattered. When people heard that Dustin pointed out a police officer as one of the killers, the rumors began. Cops weren't exactly trusted in this part of town. People who lived there had their fair share of run-ins with law enforcement themselves, or had to deal with legal issues when it came to things like child support, divorce, or even domestic calls, where they didn't feel like the cops did as much as they could. We've heard that before. And soon, a new name was being repeated. Emma White. Her name was familiar to police, and she knew Charlene, and she didn't like her. And here's the backstory. Emma and Charlene went to high school together, and they both lived at Pinewood Garden Apartments. They used to be friendly, at least acquaintances, but friends and family revealed to investigators that Charlene had become terrified of Emma. Charlene's best friend, Missy, explained that Emma was really mean. Even back in high school, everyone tried to stay away from her. But then she began targeting Charlene recently, sending her angry threats, harassing her anytime they bumped into each other in the apartment complex, because apparently there were some substance usage going on and also some sales that took place in this complex. I'm pretty sure it happens in most, but recently a big bust had happened in which Emma was arrested, and she was convinced that Charlene was a narc, that Charlene had called the cops on her. Emma believed Charlene had been placed in the apartment complex as an undercover informant, and none of that was true. But that didn't stop Emma from banging on Charlene's door, just demanding money for all the trouble that she thought Charlene had brought on her. And of course, Charlene didn't have anything to provide to her, but she was kind. And she pleaded with her to understand that she would never tell on her. She even offered her some food out of her own refrigerator, but Emma refused. Charlene tried to reason with her, saying that she would never do that because it's none of her business. But that didn't stop Emma from being belligerent, and it scared Charlene. When detectives started looking at people with motive and anger, Emma stood out. They tracked her down, and they learned she did have a past involving violence, an assault on her record, but it was back from high school. That wasn't recent, but it was enough to at least, put a red flag up. When you put that next to the harassment and the backdrop of that bust that happened and the accusations, it made her look more dangerous. So they brought her in. When they asked her where she was on the night that Charlene was killed and who could vouch for her and whether she ever went to her apartment and was angry enough to hurt Charlene, Emma answered, no. She had a strong alibi. And the more detectives dug into her whereabouts that night, the more that alibi actually held up. They cross-checked it, they tested it, they looked for cracks, and then Emma did something not everyone in the story would be willing to do, and you'll find that out later. She agreed to take a polygraph. Polygraphs, we know, are not perfect. They're not a magic truth machine, but in the context of this investigation, the fact that she was willing to sit down, be wired up, and answer detailed questions about Charlene's murder, that mattered. But according to the results, Emma was being truthful. No deception was indicated, no signs that she was hiding anything. So investigators who initially circled her as a very strong suspect had to accept that the evidence wasn't telling them that. Emma wasn't their killer. Emma's name would stick to the case for a long time in rumor and speculation because it was a very easy narrative, where a mean, angry neighbor just snaps. Who's actually watched the recent documentary, The Perfect Neighbor? It's terrifying. But officially, Emma was cleared. But the cop angle? Now that didn't diminish in the minds of those close to Charlene. What if there had been an officer that was somehow maybe taking advantage of some of the residents there who were threatening of her about the busts? And maybe since Charlene's name was being tossed around, a cop did try to pry for information, and Charlene refused, and things went south. Now that narrative was much harder for investigators to believe, but it didn't stop the rumors from swirling. But here's the question. Can anyone really rely on a 3-year-old? That was a huge question in this case, and it's what intrigued me about it and why I wanted to cover it. After that night, 3-year-old Dustin and 2-year-old Derek went to live with the one person who still felt at the center of their world, their grandma, Phyllis, Charlene's mom, and her husband, Charles. They tried their best to provide the boys with as much of normalcy as they could, but it didn't take long for something very shocking to happen. Phyllis had collected all the boys' toys, and she also bought them new ones so they would feel comfortable around her house and have something to do so that they wouldn't think about their mother. And only 4 days after Charlene was killed, Dustin, who, to be fair, was about 3.5 at this point, but still, he's a toddler. He's playing with a toy telephone in the presence of his grandmother when all of a sudden he starts saying something very weird. Things that a 3-year-old should not be saying. And Phyllis starts to realize that she needs to write these things down immediately because they're related to her daughter's murder. This little boy had saw it happen. That was clear. But what wasn't were his words. They were fragmented. He might not make sense to someone who didn't know what this little boy had been through. But it started with a policeman. He said, "I'm going to go get a belt. Go kick that window. Phone. Get the stick. I'm going to shoot you. A policeman. My mom's seen the policeman. Why you do that to my mom? Policeman hit my mommy. Put tape on her." That's what he was saying into that phone. With just those statements alone, I have chills again. Just like the first time I ever read the documents related to this case and saw that part. I was stunned. He retained memory of those moments, and Phyllis was frozen. She was looking at her grandson, who was staring at a photo of his mother in tears while he was saying all this. And there was more. She wrote it all down. Things like, he hurt my mommy, the policeman did it, the purple stick. He would also kick his legs out in front of him, almost showing how Charlene was fighting back. And through an official court document, I was able to find 2 notes that Charlene scribbled down while little Dustin was speaking into that toy telephone, and I'm going to read them to you. And even though they're fragmented, just please try to listen to what he was saying and imagine what Phyllis must have been thinking in that moment when she's listening to this. The first note transcribed these words. "I'm going to get the belt. A policeman. Go kick that window. Phone. Get the stick. I'm going to shoot you. Kick the window. Bathroom. Are you out here? Don't have no phone. A policeman. My mom's seen the policeman. Gun. Threw in garbage, sleeping on couch. I'm going to crack you. Kick the window. Not getting out of here. Bob. I'm going to your house. Corner. Call Papa. Get your radio. Go to sleep. Don't shoot. Papa got the paper. Policeman did it. Not the guy. Lights on. Big light. No telephone. You hear me? Policeman got buttons. What do you come by my house for? What do you do that to my mom? You break window? Bob. Policeman hit mommy. Put tape on her. Put nuts in her mouth. Bad boy. As Dustin said that part, where he said bad boy, he was motioning towards his neck, as to say that this man was doing something bad to Charlene's neck area. And then he picked up a picture of her and was still pretending to talk on the phone again, saying, belt hitting, not belt, but with a gun. I will break your foot, pillow, head, brother and me. I don't want to shoot. Do you want to go to bed? Policeman got out of my house. We can't get the policeman out of here. Wow. To me, that is very intense. I don't know about you, but as I was sitting reading all that, it was completely relevant to this context. And I can gather a lot. Every single time I think about him saying, like, kick the window, I feel like his mom was kicking at that window, trying to escape. The second note that I found was a little longer, but I think it's definitely worth reading to you. It's the same fragmented language, of course. This is a 3-year-old, and it went like this. The guy laughed and sticking tongue. Mom stick tongue and spit. Clap hands. Get off that bed. Shirt was ripping. Nothing was cold. Smacked hands together. The bike and pointed to brother. Mommy's shirt was dirty. Light on. Crack. Scary gun. Kicking the window with feet. Was up in bed. No. She walked up and see this gun. Police was open his mouth talking. Shoot somebody. She write on herself. She got a phone. She braked it. The car will stay here. She bumped her head. Took his hand and smacked his face. She was jumping on bed. You see that belt? Gun don't work. Brother was walking on floor. Greg and Trey knocking on door, and Mary, a while to get indoor. Get in van. He opened the door. Key. He put it on the table. Better turn the truck on. Pillow. You better wait a minute. Turn truck on. Put Pop in there. Police. That guy. Pulling on bed and chair. Well, come in the house. Police have hat like ball cap. Put pillow on mommy. Kick somebody. Set that belt. Crack somebody. Police lights on and off. Mommy jumping on bed. Again, I am shocked reading this to you. I think we can all infer what's going on here. Someone dressed in a uniform that looked like a police officer with a hat and buttons was hurting Charlene. It seems like she might have been in bed. I don't know if that meant she was on the couch, because that's where Dustin used to sleep, or if she was in her bedroom. But it definitely sounds like he's relaying a struggle, right? He's reliving it in these moments. It's like his mind is going from one side of the room to the other. Like the belt, the gun, his mom kicking. It's like he's replaying every moment. And that they had possibly pointed a gun at her, that they pulled her shirt, that her shirt was ripping, and that she saw this gun and the attacker was talking to her saying something about shooting someone. When he said she was writing on herself, honestly, the only thing I could think of was that she was bleeding at that point, which is really sad. But in a child's mind, if maybe her hands were bloody and she put them somewhere on her body, maybe he thought she was writing on herself. But what's crazy is he would have not known anything or understood anything about a pillow if it hadn't happened. The coroner had already determined that she had been smothered with a pillow. And these fragmented statements, he's mentioning a pillow. He's saying belt hitting. Not belt, but with a gun. I will break your foot, pillow, head. It sounds like this person was threatening Charlene. When he came in there, he was yelling at her, and she was trying to possibly use a phone that she doesn't have, and something was shoved in her mouth, which we know is true. So what he was saying was definitely adding up. Even the part about the belt, it was actually Charlene's. It had come from a leather jacket that was later found in her closet and matched it. So even the statement he made, I'm going to get the belt, and the belt hitting, and then he said not belt but gun, it seems like she was being hit with the belt in the beginning, and he pointed to his neck. We know there was a belt around her neck, and ultimately, we know that she had even more blunt force trauma to her head. It could have been from a gun, like this little boy is describing. This was very valuable for detectives, and as a matter of fact, they told Phyllis to bring Dustin to a child psychologist for a clinical interview. I would love your thoughts, and just please leave them in the comments. I always try to read all of them, but if you're putting everything together the way I am, or maybe something that I missed, leave it below. Think about all the things that he said, all the facts that I'm going to tell you in this case. And if you have your own assumptions or theories of what could have been happening or what he could have been seeing or how they could have been playing out, let me know, because you'll find out later why I want to know this. I just find this part to be so interesting. I would love to get your thoughts on it. But by January 30th, Phyllis had made an appointment with Dr. Dawn Lord. She was referred by one of the lead investigators on Charlene's case. Dr. Lord sat down with Dustin in the presence of his grandmother, and she spoke to him about what happened to his mom. And then she wrote her findings in a letter to a lieutenant on the case. And this was very important as evidence collection in this case. I have the letter, and I'm going to summarize it. She said that Dustin presented as a talented boy. He had many strengths, but he also had signs of anxiety and depression and some mild developmental delays. But it was important to understand that he just experienced a psychosocial stressor, actually the murder of his mom and losing his mom. That's a change in where he's living, his lifestyle, and he witnessed what happened. This professional knows how to get a child out of their shell. And ultimately, Dustin did start talking about what happened that night. The first thing he said is that the attacker threatened him with violence. He said the man told him he would kill him if he talked about what happened. Now, I'm summarizing this. This is the psychologist's letter. She's an adult. She's going to be talking like an adult. And I'm relaying her words from what she observed Dustin saying when he was speaking to her. A 3-year-old is obviously not going to be able to articulate it the way that an adult would, but through this doctor's expertise, she was able to determine what happened. He said that 2 men were in his mother's home. The men had been there before, and one had a gun. The 2 men were white. One of them wore a professional set of clothing that resembled a police officer's uniform. And Dustin said that one man started to yell at his mother, and they were both yelling back and forth louder and louder until he hit her over the head again and again with something. When Dustin was asked if he knew the name of this man that was hitting his mommy, surprisingly, he said he thought the man's name was Tim, and that he'd been over the apartment at least 2 or 3 times in the past. Now, he wasn't able to provide a last name or who this person was. He said he thought it was one of mommy's boyfriends. So with all this information, the psychologist reached out to Phyllis and Charles and asked, "Do you know a guy named Tim? Somebody that was in your daughter's life?" And they said, yes, they know 2 Tims. One is a man named Tim Green who had recently been working on Charlene's car. And Charlene also had an ex-boyfriend named Tim. This was a guy that she dated between Alan and Willard. After this, Dustin's next appointment with Dr. Lord was scheduled for a week later on February 6th. And after that, he was seen 2 more times by the same psychologist. And over time, she got more and more information that the uniform was black, that both of the men were dressed in black, one of them had a gun, and that his mother knew the man and let them in without a struggle. The 2 men were talking for some time, and when she asked how long, she said, could it be as long as a TV program like Sesame Street? And Dustin said yes. And one of the men started arguing with his mom, and it escalated until his mom was attacked. When asked where his mom was attacked, he said he thought it was the bedroom. But we do find out he did sleep in the living room, so he could have been confused as to whether she was attacked near the couch at first or if she was back in her bedroom where it started, but it didn't really matter. He also said the man who killed his mommy went to his mom's closet and got something, but he wasn't able to identify what that object was, but that he saw him hit his mom in the head with a gun on the top and on the back. What was interesting is he also mentioned that he thought the other man could have been helping his mom at one point, trying to get her out of the apartment, and that the other guy went and got the belt and hurt his mom with it. And then once his mom was dead, the 2 men were arguing with each other. Now, what's interesting, if you remember some of those fragmented statements, he said things like, go get the truck. They could have been arguing about when to leave or how to leave the premises. I'm not really sure. And I don't really think anyone was helping her. I could be wrong, but maybe they were trying to bring her downstairs in the beginning, like maybe bring her to the car, get her out of the apartment. I don't know. But what I do know is that this little boy has just described his mother's murder. But what do you do with that information? You don't even have a suspect. Well, they did track down both of the Tims, the ex-boyfriend and the mechanic, and neither one of them were involved. Both of them had solid alibis. Now, it doesn't mean that Dustin wasn't telling the truth. Maybe one of the attackers looked like, resembled her ex Tim in some way. But it was like this child was holding on to a handful of jagged, bloody puzzle pieces. And every time he opened his mouth, one of those pieces slipped out, waiting to be put together. But the problem was, adults were never going to totally agree on what those pieces meant or how much weight to give them. While Phyllis was trying to protect Dustin and help him heal, detectives were trying to figure out who could have done this to Charlene and why. With Emma ruled out, detectives turned their attention to another uncomfortable but obvious question. What about the fathers of Charlene's children? Both Alan and Willard had to be interviewed either way. Statistically, when a woman is murdered, you have to start by looking at the men closest to her, former partners, fathers of her children, anyone whose life is directly intertwined with hers emotionally or financially. So they went back to the basics. They needed to fully understand Charlene's relationships with Alan Redman and Willard McCarley. So let's start with 28-year-old Alan. Investigators learned he was Dustin's father and that he and Charlene had a short relationship that ended after their son was born. When things were ending with Alan, Charlene confided in her mom, who she was very close with, that Alan had not been treating her very well. She needed to get out. At first, he seemed like the perfect match. But after living together for about a year or so, Alan got controlling. And that was one of the first red flags. There was a time that Charlene went to her mom's house to get away from Alan, and he came over there banging on her door really late at night, asking for Charlene to come out. And Phyllis was like, no, she's sleeping. You better leave. And after that, Charlene was done. She didn't care if she had to be a single mother. She wasn't going to stay in a relationship that she wasn't happy with. Investigators then spoke to Alan and to those who knew him, including Charlene's family. And although things didn't work out between them, he was still in his son's life. He wasn't a deadbeat dad blowing off his responsibilities. He was consistently on time with his child support payments, and there were no documented blow-ups, no ongoing issues between him and Charlene. Nothing was noted in this investigation. And when detectives asked when he last saw her, Alan said it was about a week before Charlene was murdered. For the night Charlene was killed, Alan claimed he had been with his girlfriend, and his girlfriend confirmed his alibi. She said they had dinner, they watched a movie together that night, and she was with him the entire time. Now, of course, detectives weren't completely convinced. An alibi is only as strong as what backs it up. And girlfriends, partners, family, they're not seen as 100% reliable. And the other day I was watching the current case in Massachusetts unfold, Brian Walsh, the husband of Anna Walsh, who disappeared and her body was never found. Well, an investigator on that case said something. It was something to the effect of, I trust, but I verify. And I like that. It's not that they go in thinking that anyone is guilty of anything. They trust their alibis. They trust that they're true, but they verify to confirm. But nothing about Alan's history with Charlene was violent or suspicious. He didn't make it to the suspects list. He was checked off for now. And now we go to the next guy in Charlene's life, which was Willard McCarley, also 28 years old. And like Alan, Willard was the most recent ex and the father of her 2-year-old Derek. Their relationship wasn't without drama either, because remember, at this point when she's meeting him, she had just had a baby. Dustin was only 2 months old, and she ends up getting pregnant. Well, Willard doesn't think it's his baby. He's not convinced. He's like, we haven't been together that long. How do you know it's mine? She's like, I haven't slept with anyone except for you since months before this. But he still wasn't sure. And it was way too much for him. It was ugly. It was drawn out. The kind of situation that leaves bitterness on both sides. Charlene, however, stood firm. She knew who the father was. But their relationship, of course, fizzled. And Charlene was again a single mom until Derek was born. Willard actually did step up and he was there for Derek's birth, just in case he was the father. But he was still living at home at this point, and his parents, especially his mom, Sarah, really pressured Charlene into getting a paternity test done to prove that the baby was his. They had just gone through something similar years ago with their son because he had a 6-year-old. So now they're going through it again. Paternity test, sure. But Charlene was more interested in enjoying her newborn baby. If Willard didn't want to be part of her baby's life, fine. But over time, he turned out to be more interested in moving on with a new woman. And yes, from time to time, he would stop by to see Derek, but he still swore the boy wasn't his. So finally, in November of 1991, Charlene got a court order for Willard to take a paternity test. This was part of the state's program for applying for benefits and child support, something that she had already been through with Alan and his son, Dustin. It turned out Charlene was right all along. Willard was the father of Derek. And I feel like I'm on an episode of Maury, but in all seriousness, the investigators thought Willard's refusal to be involved in Derek's life and his complaints about having to pay Charlene child support, definitely moved him into more of a person of interest category, especially because it was so recent. The court had ordered the test only a couple months before Charlene's murder. There were heated arguments back and forth. Willard had already gone through this with his ex, Kim. He was paying for a 6-year-old son, and he didn't want to pay more child support. It's not uncommon. However, as soon as paternity was established, Willard's mom and dad, Larry and Sarah, wanted to be part of their grandson's life. So not only did they have him over their house, but they would come over Charlene's, and it seemed like everyone was doing their best to get along. But Charlene's mom said she saw her on the previous day before she was killed. She came to her house on January 19th, and she seemed okay, according to Phyllis, but she mentioned her daughter was afraid of Willard. He seemed so upset because there was an upcoming court hearing on February 6th, and she even considered dropping it. Why? Because she just didn't want to deal with the fact that Willard was making a big deal out of it. And this same sentiment was echoed by a guy that Charlene had just recently started talking to, Roger Harrington. They were together on Saturday before she was killed, and he told investigators she was very upset because she had an argument with Willard over some kind of paternity issue, but she didn't elaborate. So investigators are digging deeper. Phyllis's close friend Cheryl, who she worked with at a restaurant together, told investigators that Charlene came into the restaurant on Thursday, January 16th. Charlene's mom was busy, so Cheryl talked to Charlene for over an hour. She told detectives Charlene seemed distant and scared and distraught. Apparently, from what was gathered from both Cheryl and Phyllis, Charlene wasn't just having problems with Willard, she was having problems with his father, Larry. Apparently, according to what these women told investigators, Charlene had confided in Phyllis that Larry was over her apartment visiting with his grandson Derek, and while he was there, he pushed Charlene up against a wall and basically started groping her. Yeah, she was shocked. She said, "You're the grandfather of my baby. What are you doing?" There were also accusations against Larry that he had inappropriately touched another relative in his family in the past. Now, no formal charges had been brought, but the pattern of rumors around him were unsettling. So this all sounded like more than just a little tension with this family. The day after Charlene's murder on January 21st, detectives paid Willard a visit. He was living at his parents' residence, so they went there, but he wasn't home. Instead, they met with his parents, Larry and Sarah. And from what investigators already gathered, they were already closely watching not just what they said, but how they said it. And it was clear they were not fans of Charlene. Larry absolutely denied that he ever did anything inappropriate to Charlene, and a part of me understands why they probably didn't like her very much. They're trying to be on their son's side as far as like the child support is concerned, and in these type of situations, there can be a lot of accusations about the woman. Things like, she got pregnant on purpose. We've heard it before, the whole like blaming her thing, and that she's just trying to get a handout. None of those things are very nice. It doesn't make a man less responsible, though. But what struck the investigators as odd is that neither one of his parents seemed very upset that Charlene had literally been murdered. At least not the way you would expect from people whose son was her former partner. This was the mother of their grandson. She had been brutally killed. But regardless, if anyone had been brutally killed, there would be a reaction of some kind, right? But instead their focus, especially Sarah's, immediately went to Derek. Sarah was concerned about what was going on with their grandson now that Charlene was dead. There were no visible signs of grief, no questions about what happened. There wasn't any horror over the fact that their own grandson was there the night she was killed and might have seen something. The biggest concern was the custody of Derek. She was actually interested in how she might be able to get custody of her grandson, so she was laser focused on legal control rather than emotional devastation, and that definitely raised some red flags. But on the other hand, I like to play devil's advocate. I like to look at everything in a roundabout way. They were never close to Charlene. Their son only dated her a few months, if that. They didn't know her that long, and they broke up soon after she found out she was pregnant. They're of course going to be on their son's side, and it's not uncommon to be concerned about your own biological grandchild and wondering what's going to happen to them in that moment. These investigators were the only people that she could ask at that point. So I don't find that to be that out of the ordinary. Detectives need to speak to Willard, though. And his reaction was a lot like his parents. I'm not sure what they expected when an ex was hardly even around during the pregnancy, hardly even dated Charlene very long, and he finds out she's been murdered. But he wasn't shaken up. He just seemed pretty detached. Almost like This is not my tragedy. It's just something that happened, and now he's just giving facts so that he can be eliminated. He was helpful, though. He said the last time he remembered seeing Charlene was about 2 days before she was murdered. It was a Saturday, January 18th. Charlene had called him. She wanted to discuss the paternity paperwork. It had been sent to her apartment. So Willard said he and his girlfriend Tara drove over to Charlene's. They met her at the mailboxes to get the paperwork from her, and they talked for about 15 minutes about the upcoming hearing. He said he didn't even get out of his car. And in his girlfriend Tara's words, she said it was a normal, civilized conversation. Charlene walked over. They talked for a little while. Everything was normal, and there was no argument. Everything was civil. And as far as the night she was murdered, Willard said he and Tara were together that night, and he had an alibi just like Alan did. So again, like Alan, it's his girlfriend corroborating it, right? And this would have been earlier the same day that Charlene spoke to Roger later that evening when she said she was upset over Willard. His girlfriend Tara also told investigators that Willard was at her place on Sunday. He left around 11 p.m. and he explained he was home and his dad was there, and ultimately he fell asleep on the couch. His brother came in later, and so does his mom. So they all saw him. And Tara told detectives the very next day, Willard was at her work early in the morning dropping off flowers. Again, though, you have a girlfriend and family members saying that you were not there on the night of a murder. So they kind of take it with a grain of salt. But now investigators want to ask people from the apartment complex whether they had seen Charlene near the mailboxes on Saturday speaking with anybody. And a couple people said they did. At least one person, a neighbor and friend of Charlene's named Joyce Harper, said that she recalled seeing Charlene standing near the apartment complex, near the mailboxes, talking to someone in a car. Then Missy Green, Charlene's best friend, said the same night Charlene told her she was so upset that she got in an argument with Willard. So we've got varying reports. Clearly, more people on Charlene's side are saying there was an argument. People on Willard's side is saying that everything was civil. And also, I want to just point out, things can be interpreted by a person differently. So if things didn't go the way Charlene wanted, she could consider that an argument, even if no voices were raised, let's say, right? I'm sure this was not a comfortable experience for anyone. You've got your ex, his new girlfriend is over there, your apartment, you're talking about a very sensitive topic. You're gearing up for a court hearing, one in which you know Willard and his family are not looking forward to. So during the investigation, almost everyone was willing to sit down for a polygraph. Remember telling you that almost everyone was willing, but there were people who refused. And that was members of the McCarley family, so Willard's family. They declined, and they have every right to. Polygraphs are not mandatory, and they're not always accurate. But investigators tend to lean towards thinking, if you truly have nothing to hide, why not just take the test? But other people feel like, I might be really nervous, and that could trigger the polygraph machine to alert deception, even though I'm not lying. So I understand both sides. But investigators usually use a polygraph in order to know what direction to go in and to kind of check someone off their list more than circling a name over and over again because there's still questions. But despite all of this, all the interviews, the evidence collection, Dustin's unsettling phrases, the careful scrutiny of Alan and Willard and the McCarley family, by February of 1992, Charlene's case was already beginning to cool down. There were still no people they could definitely point to and say they did this. For Charlene's family, it felt like they were trapped in a nightmare, and they couldn't move forward. It was true that the boys had a new routine. Phyllis had a new role as caretaker in their life. But there was still a killer out there. Think about that. No amount of love or new routine is going to fix the fact that there's a killer walking on the streets who did this. And this is usually the part of a case when I start telling you about the DNA evidence. But back in 1992, DNA testing was, becoming a little bit more reliable and powerful, but still had a long way to go. In order to get any valuable results back in that time, you needed a pretty significant sample, a large sample, in order to get a significant profile. I'm talking about blood DNA, not saliva or skin cells, because those were much less likely to yield a result. The only blood that was present in the apartment belonged to Charlene. So unless they had another DNA profile, they couldn't link, forensically anyway, any evidence to anyone. And even if they did have a profile, the only way they could test it is if they collected someone else's DNA. Many items were swabbed, including the leather belt that was found on her neck, the soda can, different parts of the bathroom, bedroom doorknobs, things that people would normally touch, especially in a struggle. And all those swabs were preserved in the event that DNA testing advanced in the future, which we know it has. But the case had stalled. Charlene's mom and dad did hold a press conference with the police. They begged the public for information, and there was a $10,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest. And still nothing. Nothing but rumors. In a small town, that's normal. And I mean, it's normal everywhere. But in Twinsburg, people wondered, am I working alongside a killer? They were out there somewhere. They thought, could it be my friend? Could it be a coworker, a family member? It's terrifying. And a lot of residents were coming forward with tips, right? Because, if anything looks suspicious and a killer's on the loose, you're going to maybe see a random guy getting in his car, or, I don't know, something strange at night. Or this one person said a guy was getting his car fixed because he was going out of town, and they were like, why? So they're questioning everything. And of course, it's the cop's job to chase down all those leads. But it was never anything concrete. Charlene's mom spoke out a lot. She made statements about how it was so unfair that this killer was out there living their life. And they took Charlene's. Phyllis consistently spoke to reporters. She was always reaching out to investigators, always trying to figure out what was going on in her daughter's case and keep it in the newspaper again and again so that no one would forget about it. Charlene's family and friends, they would put posters all around town. They wanted to remind this community that if they knew something, they should say something. These posters were everywhere, at restaurants, at family stores, even at the Ford factory, right up there on the bulletin board. And one of them said, "Who murdered my daughter?" And it had a beautiful picture of Charlene on it. They were hoping that someone would finally come forward, but nobody did. By May of that year, Dustin was again sitting down with Dr. Lord and having yet another session. And because of all the questions surrounding the situation between Charlene and Willard, and the fact that Dustin had said the man who came in hit his mom and was one of her ex-boyfriends, even though he said the guy's name was Tim, they decided to put Willard's picture in a lineup with 5 other men's photos. Because see, they're like, okay, if he's saying it's an ex-boyfriend, why don't we just test it? Why don't we test the theory? And since they know there were tension between Charlene and Willard, they say, why not give it a shot? Also because the police officer that was wearing the Tuffy jacket had brown hair and a mustache, and so did Willard. Alan did not. He was blonde with a clean-shaven face. So that was the other dad. They did this twice with Dustin. And both times, he actually picked Willard out of the lineup of photos. Is that shocking? To some, yes. To others, no, because Willard was a familiar face. He had been around his mom. He had been in the apartment, but it was just like another red flag. There was just something that kind of didn't sit well with this family, but it does seem a little extreme that someone would have done something like this to Charlene over child support. But others may say, no, that's not extreme at all. People have killed for much less. But there wasn't any physical evidence tying anyone to this crime. So unfortunately, the case did end up going cold. And if you're wondering what happened to Charlene's children, her older child, Dustin, did end up going to live with his father, Alan, and Derek, who was in the sole custody of Charlene before she passed away, stayed with Charlene's mom. He was already established there. He was already acclimated to his living space. And because that hearing never happened in February, custody diverted from Charlene to her mom, not Willard and his parents. 2 years go by. Now it's January of 1994. And Phyllis is still doing everything she can to keep Charlene's name in the media and keep this case alive. They have a memorial service at a church. It was the 2nd anniversary of her murder. And Phyllis talked about what a good mom Charlene was, how she used to take the boys camping and swimming and having cookouts and campfires, and how her pain has not lessened over the years. She said she thought about Charlene every single day, and that you never know when you lose someone like this how hard it is. But she reminded everyone that her grandsons are the ones that are suffering the most, that they were cheated, that their mother was taken from them when they were just babies, and they'll never have her. She was still begging the public for information. And by 1998, it had been 6 years since Charlene was killed, and the case was still unsolved. The Akron Beacon Journal came back into town to tell the story, checking in with the family. This family had never gotten an ending. They interviewed Phyllis, who by then had been living in this strange limbo for more than half a decade. Her voice still cracked. She still cried. And she didn't sugarcoat anything. She said, there is no new evidence, no new leads. Basically, there's nothing they can do. And imagine being a mom saying that about your child's murder case on the record to a reporter. Not because you don't care, but because you've been told so many times over and over again, there's nothing to do in this case, it's just cold. That the case file is just gathering dust. And in that same article, Phyllis talked about what had happened to Charlene's boys as the years went on. Dustin, the oldest, who was living with his father, was still seeing her every other weekend. So he wasn't completely cut off from Phyllis. But his day-to-day life had shifted into a new reality with his dad. And Derek, the youngest, continued to live with her, growing up in the shadow of the story that he was too young to even understand or remember, but old enough to be shaped by. Even with the distance and the different household dynamics, the two boys were growing up with the same hole in their lives. They don't have their mom. They were learning to navigate birthdays, holidays, school days, with the unspoken truth that their mother had been taken away from them. No one's going to talk about that, but I'm sure it was whispered about because this whole town knew. But her family didn't just sit back and do nothing. On every anniversary of her death, year after year, they took action. They would again plaster those flyers around town, asking for information, putting her face, her name, her story into the public again, hoping that at least maybe some guilt would finally crack someone open, that someone who stayed quiet would decide enough was enough. But guess what? 2002 came around. A decade later, and still no answers. No calls that broke this case open. No sudden confessions. No new evidence. From the outside, it really did look like Charlene's case was frozen in time. On paper, it was stagnant. But things were happening. They were happening in the background, and nobody could see that yet. This was the year that something finally shifted. Not because a detective found some hidden piece of evidence locked away, but because a person did decide to talk. A man named Charles Kincaid, he walked into this story. Charles wasn't family. He wasn't a friend or even a neighbor. He was someone that worked at a local Ford factory for the past decade. He didn't even know Charlene, but like everyone else in this town, he never forgot her story. He saw the posters. He read the articles. He even talked to coworkers who knew Charlene, and he felt terrible for her family, especially her little boys. But he never knew that he would be the center of this investigation so many years later. Charles was now sitting in an interview room at the police station. He'd willingly come down saying that he believed he could have a lead in this case. And he felt very compelled to at the least let them know, just in case. And he explained. He had this coworker, and they weren't close, but he had worked with him for 10 years. And this coworker had made not one, but two very weird statements. One was more recent, the other was a couple years back, but both of them were about killing someone. Was it even legit? He wasn't sure. But the first time, it was on a road trip with two other men from work. They were engaging in small talk to pass the time while they were driving, and the topic of the army came up. Normal. Charles had served, and he expressed how traumatic it had been. But then this guy just piped up in the backseat, and he's like, I killed someone. Never bothered me. That first comment struck Charles as kind of odd, but he kind of forgot about it. But more recently, he ran into the same coworker, this time at the shooting range. They got to talking, and Charles mentioned that in the army, they would actually use targets with real human faces on them, and they said the thinking behind it was that you would get used to shooting someone human, someone that can look back at you with their eyes. And that's when this coworker said, well, when I killed someone, I looked right into their eyes and I had no problem with it. You don't remember the eyes. Now this time, Charles paid more attention. This guy wasn't in the army. He wasn't in law enforcement. So why would he have a reason to look someone in the eyes and watch the life fade from them? And he said it with no remorse and no emotion. And Charles couldn't let it go. He started to take note of any other conversations he'd ever remembered having with this guy. And that's when it hit him. Way back in 1992, when they first started working together, this guy was sitting around complaining about some girl that he had dated, trying to get him on the hook for child support. But he wasn't the father. He was adamant that he could prove it wasn't his kid. And he wasn't happy. Well, that woman was Charlene. And that guy that was spewing all of this, including the weird comments, was none other than Willard McCarley. And I'm sure you could have guessed. And once again, Charles, putting two and two together, was like, oh my God. If Willard killed someone and his ex is dead, could he have killed his ex? It seemed way too weird to be a coincidence, and that's why he went to police. And for detectives, this could have been huge. They'd already suspected Willard from the beginning. It was the kind of thing that definitely makes your adrenaline go higher, right? And you're thinking this has been dead end after dead end for years. And here's someone coming in unprompted saying, you know what? He told me he killed someone. He didn't even care. But as compelling as it was, Charles's statements are not enough by themselves. You cannot put a man on trial for murder based on a coworker's recollection of some chilling comments that were made over the years. Especially when the defense can argue that memories will blur, people mishear things or they exaggerate, and grudges exist. Okay, maybe he was talking crap. But Charles's information did do something. It strengthened suspicions, it reignited focus on Willard, and it lit up a fire again in her case. At least enough for investigators to see what Willard had been up to since 1992. And they're going back, they're pulling up any records, and they find out that back on December 19th of 1995, so this was 3 years following Charlene's murder, there had been a domestic incident over at Willard McCarley's home. Now, this is completely unrelated to anything with Charlene, but in that police report, an officer noted that when they came to his house to speak with him in his garage, a deputy realized there was a sheriff's jacket and a sheriff's baseball cap hanging on one of those moving dollies. Well, that's contraband. You're not supposed to be in possession of a police-issued Tuffy jacket unless you're obviously in law enforcement, which he wasn't. So those were confiscated. But do you see the connection? Willard was in possession of a cop's jacket and a ball cap. Why? The person that little Dustin had mentioned seeing that night hit his mom was dressed like a cop. That's crazy. It's just another connection that doesn't seem unrelated at all. And what's so frustrating is that all along, Willard was the one person, pretty much the only person that seemed to have even the slightest motive to harm Charlene. But now the comments, the connection, the jacket, just like the ones the cops wear in the winter, is found in his home. Things Dustin said he saw at just 3 years old. But here's what's unfortunate. Those items, they were not related to Charlene's case. They were not preserved as evidence. They were probably thrown away. They were never tested. They couldn't even be located. This was so many years later. They were confiscated because they were in possession by Willard. Because it's unlawful. Something that's issued to police cannot be in the hands of a civilian. But it was another dead end. But at the very least, they're collecting circumstantial evidence, right? And 2 years later, in 2004, the world had changed in one crucial way for investigators. DNA technology had finally advanced, and the detectives working Charlene's case decided they weren't going to waste this opportunity. They pulled out all of the most critical evidence and one very haunting piece, the belt that had been wrapped around Charlene's neck. That belt had been photographed, documented, and stored, and now it was given a second life as a potential witness in this case. The attacker held it tightly. He could have transferred skin cells or sweat to the surface. Now, initial DNA testing of the belt and the pillows and the pillowcases did not produce any profiles, but this is back in 1992. So they're resubmitted. The belt, the fingernail clippings this time, the pillows, the pillowcases, as well as the plastic bag that had been shoved in Charlene's mouth. And now they're getting new forensic testing done. They're hoping that with new technology, they can pull something more than the older methods had. They weren't just looking for biological material. They were looking for a DNA profile of a killer. But unfortunately, the fingernail clippings had no DNA on them besides Charlene's. The plastic bag had no DNA present. The pillow and the pillowcases found near her body did have a partial DNA profile of 3 male contributors. However, these results were inconclusive. There just wasn't enough DNA on them, and most of us know that pillows and pillowcases, they aren't always cleaned very thoroughly over the years, and there could have been other males besides the killer inside Charlene's house at one point that could have sweat on them, drooled on them, transferred their DNA to those pillows. But the belt was significant. And they get a partial male DNA profile. Now, this wasn't a full profile, but at least they had something. Now, all they needed was a suspect's DNA to compare it to. And that's when they obtained a warrant for Willard's DNA, a buccal swab. He had no choice. He had to comply. And when it was compared, It was a match. But no, this is not a slam dunk if that's what you were thinking. And I'm going to get to that. Another reason why I really want to talk about this case was because of some of the angles that you can look at things from. This partial match meant that a descendant on the male side of the McCarley family had DNA present on this belt that belonged to Charlene. And this belt used to be inside the belt loops on a matching leather jacket that was in her closet. One that she wore during the winter months, and she was killed in January. Do you see the problem here? The problem is that Derek, Charlene's son, who was only 2 at the time, he was Willard's biological son, which meant he carried the same male DNA profile as his father. He was one of the male descendants of the McCarley family. So even though Willard could be a match, Willard's dad could be a match, and Willard's son could be a match, and Derek lived there. If you're a mom, you'll know it's not uncommon for a 2-year-old to drool on something that you own, to touch something that you own with their tiny, grimy little fingers that they just put in their mouth. So to me, unfortunately, this wasn't that significant. And to Willard and his attorneys, it wouldn't be either. It was inconclusive because it was partial, and it was linked to a male that lived in that home. But nonetheless, the DA believed they could get a conviction because of the other circumstantial evidence in this case, the tension between them, the way that Willard fought paternity, the fact that they had a hearing coming up and he didn't want to pay child support. They dug deeper, and they found out that he had threatened his last girlfriend over the same thing. She called him threatening. Also, Willard matched the characteristics of the cop on scene that Dustin pointed to. He had a mustache and brown hair, just like the cop. Dustin also picked Willard twice out of a lineup. Do you think any of that's a coincidence? I don't. Charlene would have let Willard and his father Larry inside that apartment, and we'll get to him too. And most of all, they would have cared about what happened to at least 2-year-old little Derek, Willard's biological son. So don't you think it would have been kind of likely that they would have taken those keys, locked the door behind them, so the little boys cannot unlock it on their own, very easily at least. And don't forget, Willard and his dad both had reasons why they would have wanted Charlene out of the picture. Larry had allegedly groped her, and he was already kind of possibly facing charges for another incident. And Willard had that hearing coming up. He was already paying for his 6-year-old son and living with his parents in their basement at the time. He didn't know how he was going to be able to afford yet another child. Now that they had Willard in their crosshairs, the DA's office was asking around, trying to firm up their case. They were re-interviewing old witnesses and digging up new ones. It had been so many years later. So whether or not this is compelling would be up to a jury, but a guy named Pasquale, he came forward. Now, he had been convicted of robbery. He served 4 years in prison, so you have to keep that in mind. But he told investigators he remembered being at an unemployment line back in 1992 with Willard. And he was really upset, and he was making all these comments that he would kill Charlene before ever paying her a dime. And this man wasn't the only one who now years later is claiming that Willard made a similar statement to them. Charlene's best friend Missy told investigators that Willard had gotten in an argument with Charlene on January 18th near the mailboxes, but she added that Willard said to her, "You will not live to see the upcoming paternity-related court date." And then Charlene's mom echoed the same thing. She said on the evening of January 19th, when Charlene came to visit her, she told her that Willard had threatened her the night before, saying that he would see her dead before he would pay her child support. But this was not something that she disclosed to police in 1992, according to reports. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just because a police officer doesn't write it in his notes, which he's supposed to do though, because you're supposed to be keeping very accurate notes, especially in 1992, when I don't think we were using computers, and they don't, it usually means it didn't happen. But it's for a jury to decide, right? Even the neighbor, remember the lady Joyce who said that she saw Charlene at the mailboxes talking to Willard that night? Well, now she said she remembered the man grabbing Charlene's arm from inside the car. Another fact that kind of seems to be added. So were people remembering more over time? Or were these memories fabricated somehow now that more evidence had come forward from the man at the unemployment office? And now maybe they're just backing it up because they want to see justice done and put someone behind bars. Well, in 2004, while all this is being compiled, Willard McCarley was married. He's vacationing out in Arizona. He had no idea that a grand jury was serially convening. And as he's relaxing at a resort, cops are at his door with a warrant. He was indeed indicted for Charlene's murder, and on Thursday, May 13th of 2004, 41-year-old Willard McCarley was arrested for the murder of Charlene Puffenbarger. And the news reached Charlene's family, and you know what? Even though they were happy, this was a very complex situation. There's a bunch of emotions. There's anger, there's grief. There's something that seems like hope because now someone's behind bars. But Charlene's brother, Ken, spoke to the media, and he said how deeply emotional that day was for all of them. After so many anniversaries, so many flyers and interviews, by this time, Charlene's dad had passed away, so he didn't even get to see justice. And Phyllis said, there's nothing they can do. They just have to go with the flow. But finally, a name with evidence strong enough to get to a courtroom. But they all knew that this wasn't the end of the story at all. This was just one more chapter. They knew they would have to sit in a courtroom and listen to Charlene's death reconstructed piece by piece over and over again while the man accused of killing her was just feet away. The first trial, and yes, I said first trial. I'm going to go over these quickly, but you got to hear this part, was January of 2005, and it was only the beginning. By then, Dustin was 16, Derek was 15. They were a lot more grown up than they were when their mother was killed. They were now, not quite adults, but in their teens, and they're watching this unfold with Willard, Derek's own father, even though estranged all those years, as the murderer, allegedly. The prosecutor's version was simple. This wasn't a random act of violence. This is a man who had been told by DNA test that he was the father and who decided that eliminating Charlene was easier than facing his financial and moral responsibility. The way the suspicion circled back to Willard again and again. And finally, the DNA on the belt, tying him physically to one of the weapons used to incapacitate her. Willard's defense team went after Dustin and all of his childhood statements, and they did it aggressively. They argued that the things Dustin, as a 3-year-old, told his grandmother and told this Dr. Don Lord were tainted. They were not just raw, unfiltered memories. They were recollections, but they were influenced, in their perspective, by police, by mental health workers, and by the adults around him that were grieving and scared and desperate for answers. And they also pointed out that Dr. Lord, the child psychologist who had interviewed Dustin, had lost her license. So that fact gave them even more ammunition to question her methods, her credibility, and by extension, everything she said that Dustin told her. And I was like, yikes, that was a really powerful blow to the prosecution. Even before the jury got to hear any of that, the judge agreed with the defense that Dustin's early statements, those chilling phrases, the description of the man dressed like a police officer saying, "I will kill you," they were ruled inadmissible. So this one person who had actually been in that apartment when Charlene was attacked had now been silenced in the courtroom. The prosecution had to move forward without the most haunting evidence that they had. But they still had the DNA and other circumstantial evidence. And in the end, after a number of witnesses, including the ones I already told you about, unemployment office, Charlene's best friend, her mom, the neighbor, the jury believed the prosecution. And on February 4th, Willard McCarley was found guilty. Only a few days later at sentencing, he was given life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. It wasn't closure. It wasn't going to erase the 11 years of emptiness and uncertainty, but finally, they had a name and a face. It let them walk out of a courtroom knowing that at the very least, Willard was responsible on paper. However, Willard had no intention of accepting that as the final word. What I gather from him, and I don't know, just from no, I'm not the father, and fighting everything, I just feel like he's the type of person, this is just me perceiving all the information, kind of like a mama's boy. Kind of reminds me of Stephen Stearns, if you're following the Madeline Soto case out of Florida. Just seems like he's always gotten his way, and that he just doesn't, he can't allow anything to be his responsibility. Nope, I'm going to blame someone else and shift the blame. But he made it clear right away, I'm going to appeal. And he did. And guess what? He got granted a second trial in 2007. That's why I said that was the first one. And can you imagine for her family and the boys? It's just it's reopening everything. They had to do it all again. See all the photos, hear the medical examiner describe her injuries, listen to the defense twisting everything and minimizing what happened. And once again, the state presented its case, and once again, the narrative came down to the same points: the DNA on the belt, the motive tied to the child support, the denial of paternity, and the cruel way that Charlene had been killed. And of course, the fact that Willard remained at the center of all of this. Once again, the defense did what they could to cast doubt, but for the second time, the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Willard stood in that courtroom as he was found guilty again. His face barely even changed. No breakdown, no remorse. Just a man hearing again that the jury believed he murdered the mother of his kid. And at the sentencing that year, it wasn't just the lawyers and the judges that were talking, because Charlene's youngest son, Derek, was now old enough to speak to the man who had been absent for most of his life and who had just been convicted twice of murdering his mom. Derek finally faced his father and told him exactly how he felt. He told Willard that he believed he was worthless. That carried a lot of weight. An entire childhood spent without a mom, of watching his family drag themselves through courtroom, of knowing this man had been fighting harder for his own freedom than he even fought for his own son. That's pretty big. The legal outcome, however, was that Willard was sentenced to life in prison again. And for many families, that would have been the end of the court battles. You survive one trial, maybe two, and then as painful as it is, you settle into life. And the legal side is finished. But Charlene's family did not get that luxury, because Willard, I feel like we need to be like Willard, where there's a Willard, there's a way, because in this man's world, he wasn't done. Third time's a charm, right? It wouldn't be until 2014, and the appeal was granted again, more than 20 years after Charlene's death. And the people that loved her the most were being told, you're going back to court for the third damn time. It happened in 2017. Think about that for a second. Most cases never even see a courtroom once. Charlene's murder was retried 3 separate times, more than 25 years after she was killed. And Dustin finally spoke. He was now 28 years old. He was no longer a 3-year-old little boy with the words that were ruled too tainted, too unreliable. This time, he took the stand. And he told the court what he remembered. And according to his testimony, there were 2 men in that apartment that night. He described one as very tall and the other one as short. For context, Willard was only 5'5", which is short for a man, so he was most likely the shorter guy there that night. Dustin told the jury he remembered hearing screams coming from the living room. He watched as one of the men threatened him while the other one smothered his mother. But Willard's defense team did what defense teams do. They tried to dismantle it. They pushed Dustin. What are the specific details of the crime? And he could not recall. They questioned how much a 3-year-old could truly remember, how memories change over time, how things you're told later can blend with what you actually saw. And they also went after the DNA evidence again. The prosecution treated the DNA on the belt as a very strong indicator that Willard had had his hands on it and that he murdered Charlene. But the defense tried to make it sound much less certain. They argued the DNA profile was not a 1 in a billion match. It was far more common. According to them, 1 in 82 people can share the same DNA sequence. In other words, they claim the DNA could have come from any male in the McCarley family, which I told you, including Derek, Charlene's own son. Their goal was clear, not to prove who committed the murder, but to convince the jury they couldn't be sure if it was Willard. That was the heart, reasonable doubt. Not building your own story, but breaking down the prosecution's side. But the jury had heard enough. After deliberation, the verdict came back guilty again for the 3rd time. A jury listened to the facts. They found Willard McCarley guilty of the murder of Charlene Puffenbarger. He was sentenced one more time to life in prison. And by sentencing, as you can imagine, Charlene's family is exhausted. Phyllis said she was grateful that justice had finally been upheld again, but she also spoke openly about how devastating it was to have to keep reliving the trial over and over again, every appeal, back in the courtroom again, back in that living room in Pinewood Gardens, back to the moment she learned her daughter was gone. She addressed Willard. She told him she was relieved that he would not be able to hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her daughter. But then something happened that no one even expected. I was kind of like, whoa. Dustin, who had finally been able to testify, as I told you, also spoke to Willard. He's not the biological son, that's Derek. But this is Dustin, the one who witnessed his mom's murder. Can you imagine? Well, you would think maybe he would scream, he would curse at this man, he would wish the worst on him, but instead, he does something incredibly compassionate, but very complicated. He said that in Willard's position, he would have probably pursued every possible appeal as well. He understood why Willard kept fighting all the verdicts, even if he hated what those appeals had put his family through. And then, Dustin did something that stunned this entire courtroom. He asked the judge if he could give Willard a hug. It was a gesture that went way beyond anger and forgiveness. It was just one of those moments where you can just see this lifetime of pain and confusion, and it's just wrapped up in this one simple human request. And for a second, it looked like it was going to happen, but the judge was like, no. The rules, the setting, the security concerns, whatever the reasoning, no was no. Dustin was not allowed to hug the man convicted 3 times of killing his mom. I'm kind of glad because man doesn't deserve a hug in my opinion. If Dustin was the embodiment of grace and empathy in that moment, Charlene's brother Ken was the opposite. Anger. He didn't hold back. He looked at Willard and he told him, "You deserve to be there. I hope you die there in prison." Has he run out of ways to appeal, you might ask? Well, he did it again in 2019. And in May of 2024, just last year, his 4th appeal was denied. But you know, if you know me, I do like to be fair when I talk about these cases, which means if there is something that I see that I question, I'm going to say something about it. And even though I believe there is a lot of compelling circumstantial evidence against Willard, by all means enough to convict someone 3 times, I do also think there's a lot of questions in this case. And maybe you'll disagree, and that's okay. For me personally, if I was a juror, I would need more. For someone to spend the rest of their life in prison, it doesn't mean he didn't do it. Remember, just because I say something like that, it just means the prosecution would have needed to give me more concrete evidence. And it doesn't appear that there has been anything new discovered. And I find that really hard to believe. I wondered, of the 150 items collected, wasn't there anything else? Well, it was winter, so maybe the killer wore gloves. Maybe that's why there was no fingerprints or DNA left behind. And since this wasn't an SA case, and no one else was in her orbit that had any problems with her other than Willard, all signs really do point directly to him. As for whether or not his dad was involved, because remember I said I was going to circle back to him, it seems kind of obvious that if anyone was going to help him, it would be his dad. And like I said, he had a reason to want Charlene to maybe be silenced as well, and none of them wanted to take a polygraph. In the end, we will not know 100%, but Willard seemed to have the most to gain from Charlene being dead. Not only that, he had the cop's jacket and hat, which Dustin spoke about on his little fake telephone. He fought the paternity and the child support, and people have killed for less. Some question whether it was right for Charlene to file for child support. Maybe they blame her. I don't. That's a person's right and responsibility. Willard was still the dad. And if he had gone to court and had that hearing, a judge would have decided what was fair. Charlene was doing the best that she could. She wasn't just sitting around, she was working. She was watching other people's children for extra money. There's not many jobs that a single mom of 2 young children under the age of 5 can do, especially when they can't afford childcare on their own. It's really unfortunate how hard it is to get help sometimes, and it's really hard. It's a situation that I've personally been in. Charlene shouldn't have been in any danger by simply holding Willard to his part of helping with his biological child. But this case isn't really about DNA on a belt or how many times a jury said the word guilty. To me, it's about a young mother whose life was taken in a moment of absolute cruelty that will never match her eagerness to give her sons the best life possible. Think about it. All she was doing was attempting to get extra support. Doesn't match. You don't kill someone over that. 2 boys lost so much that night. They didn't just lose their mother. They lost all the future things they were supposed to have with their mother. Every birthday, every achievement, every hard day. That you just need your mom's voice. It seriously makes me sad and tear up. That was all stolen from them because of someone's selfish choice. And yet, they showed up in court again and again. They said their mom's name. They told the world who she was to them, even though they only knew her when they were 2 and 3 years old. If there's one thing Charlene's story drives home, it's that we need to listen. We need to listen to someone who says they're scared, and even to children. Maybe they don't have the right words, but they're trying desperately to tell us something that they've seen. That's bravery. We owe it to families like Charlene's to keep paying attention long after the cameras move on, because we need to fight for justice. It's one of those stories that really sticks with me. And I thank you so much for being here for Charlene's story. I'm really eager to see your thoughts on this one, even if they're different from mine. That's totally okay. And I'll see you in my very next video. Bye.